Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we dig into complex topics, try to cut through some of the noise, and really get to the heart of what matters.
That's the goal.
So today, we're tackling something that's, well, it's fascinating, but it could also be quite unsettling for many people.
Right.
We're looking at the huge, incredibly diverse culinary traditions of China. Specifically, those parts that often seem unusual or maybe even challenging to outsiders.
Yeah, that's something you hear a lot.
When you think about Chinese food, the sheer breadth is just amazing, so
Yeah.
rich, so inventive.
Absolutely. A culinary powerhouse, really.
But then, for many people, you hear about ingredients like, spiders, snakes, worms, bats, other less common things used in some regional dishes, and it definitely sparks a question, a big one.
It really does. And it's a curiosity you find pretty much worldwide. I mean, Chinese cuisine is rightly praised for its history, its depth, its skill in using almost anything to create unique flavors.
Hmm.
But the natural question that pops up is, why? Why would a culture with such an amazing food history, a civilization that's achieved so much, also eat things that many other cultures find, well, frankly, a bit unorthodox or even
Well,
shocking?
Is it just cultural difference?
Hmm.
Or maybe some kind of deep-seated, adventurous palate?
That's what people often wonder.
And that's really the core question we want to unpack today. Because what our deep dive into the sources shows is that behind this incredible culinary range, there's something, well, something much deeper and honestly far more painful.
Yeah.
A reason that goes way beyond just exploring different tastes. It really points towards a historical trauma, something so immense, so deeply scarring, that for most of us, who haven't lived through anything like it, it's almost impossible to really grasp the full impact.
It's hard to imagine.
Imagine having to eat things you never ever thought of as food. Not because you're curious, not for the taste, but
Well,
just
yeah.
just to survive, to stay alive. That's the kind of background we're exploring here.
That puts it into perspective. And yeah, our mission today is really to unravel these complex threads, the history, the society, the psychology that have shaped China's relationship with food so profoundly.
We need to look at the impact of extreme scarcity, right? And specifically that tragic event in the 20th century, the Great Mao Famine.
Exactly. We need to understand those historical roots. And then we'll connect them to some pretty surprising modern-day challenges, things that are happening right now. It shows how events from decades, even centuries ago, are still echoing, still shaping the nation today.
Okay, let's get into it. To really understand this unique food relationship, we have to start way back. We need to look at the historical foundations.
Right.
Things like its huge population, the land itself, and the often very authoritarian ways its leaders have governed for, well, millennia. It's a story that really starts with demographics.
Absolutely. That is foundational. China is an enduring demographic challenge. Let's think back to the late 17th century, a time we often think of as the peak for many empires. You had the Ottoman Empire, right? A huge, powerful entity stretching across continents. Its population then, estimated around 30 million people, give or take.
30 million seems like a lot for back then.
It was a major power. But now, consider China during that exact same period. Its estimated population was something like 130 million.
Wow. 130 million
Yeah.
compared to 30.
Yeah. And this wasn't just a blip. It wasn't a temporary thing. Historically, China has always had a significantly larger population than most other major nations or empires, consistently. Even after terrible wars or natural disasters wiped out huge numbers, the population base remained enormous. This constant, massive demographic size is just crucial for understanding Chinese history and its relationship with food.
That's a staggering difference. More than 4 times the Ottoman Empire at its peak.
Yeah.
So how? How did China manage to sustain, and not just sustain, but consistently maintain, such a huge population for centuries?
Well, there are a few key reasons, and they're kind of intertwined. First, geography plays a big role. China is just vast. It's one of the world's largest countries. And maybe more importantly, it has incredibly fertile lands. Think about the North China Plain, the Yangtze River Basin. These are some of the most productive agricultural zones on the planet, historically.
Okay, so good land.
And second, diverse climates. You go from temperate zones to subtropical zones. That means they could grow a huge variety of crops. Rice in the south, wheat and millet further north. Agriculture has always been the absolute bedrock of Chinese civilization.
Makes sense. Food production capacity.
Exactly. This constant agricultural abundance, often boosted by really sophisticated irrigation systems and intensive farming techniques developed over thousands of years, it just fostered higher food production. And that leads to greater population growth compared to most neighboring areas. This farming power was its greatest strength for centuries.
But you also said it was its greatest vulnerability.
Precisely. Which brings us to this massive population being like a Damocles sword hanging over China.
Okay, unpack that analogy,
Yeah.
a Damocles sword. How did that constant population pressure shape things like government and culture?
It's a really fitting analogy, I think, because a huge population, if you can manage it well, feed it, keep it organized, yeah, it's an incredible source of power. You've got immense human capital for labor, for defense, for building things.
Right, strength in numbers.
But that same huge population is simultaneously a catastrophic risk if things go wrong. If it's mismanaged, if the crops fail, if there's a drought or a flood.
Then you have disaster on a massive scale.
Unimaginable scale, yeah. Even a slight misstep in how things are run or a big ecological shock could trigger widespread famine, unlike almost anywhere else. That could lead to social collapse, maybe even self-destruction. This constant precariousness, this deep-seated risk, it created this powerful imperative, culturally and governmentally, for absolute control.
Control to prevent chaos.
Basically, yes. It pushed society towards centralized power, often very authoritarian power, because that was seen as the best defense against chaos and starvation. It also fostered this unique kind of collective resilience, one that often prioritized stability, obedience to whoever was in charge over individual dissent, even when things were incredibly tough.
So survival, collective survival trumped everything else.
Often, yes, this isn't just about avoiding famine in a practical sense. It's about centuries of a deeply ingrained psychology of survival. And that echoes even today, you know?
Okay, so for thousands of years, how did China actually manage this huge population? How did they navigate that knife edge between power and peril? The sources mention this phrase, food and an iron fist. What did that actually mean for ordinary people's lives?
Well, for millennia, the approach to governing the masses was often stark, sometimes brutal, an authoritarian system built for control and stability above all else. The core idea was this combination, meticulously controlling who gets food and how much, paired with rigid, often merciless enforcement of rules.
Food as a tool of control.
Absolutely. And within this system, especially for the peasants who formed the agricultural backbone, they were often treated less like individuals with rights and more like cogs, highly regimented parts of a giant production machine.
Like robots, the outline suggested.
That's a strong term, but in some ways it captures the state's perspective. Their lives were tightly controlled. Their main job was to work and produce food or goods for the state, often with very little thought given to their own well-being or freedom.
And the iron fist part wasn't just a metaphor, I assume. There were real harsh consequences.
Oh, definitely not a metaphor. The state put in place extremely rigid production quotas for whole villages, sometimes for individual peasant families. And these weren't suggestions, they weren't negotiable, they were absolute commands.
And if you failed,
If a village or a person failed to deliver the demanded amount, the consequences were severe and fast. You might face direct physical punishment, beatings, forced labor under terrible conditions.
Wow.
But maybe even more commonly, and arguably more terrifying for people living right on the edge, your own allocated food rations would be drastically cut.
so basically a death sentence.
For someone living at subsistence level, yeah, pretty much. A cut in rations wasn't just hardship. It often meant death from starvation or related diseases. This system created this constant crushing pressure on everyone to just work relentlessly and, crucially, to remain absolutely obedient.
The threat of starvation as the ultimate enforcer.
Exactly. That ever-present fear, that specter of hunger, was an incredibly powerful tool for coercion. It ensured compliance, it minimized dissent. It was a system that valued order in production far, far above individual rights or happiness.
Which leads to this really interesting, almost confusing point you raised earlier. Despite these incredibly harsh conditions, this persistent severe oppression of peasants lasting for centuries.
Yeah.
Why haven't we seen more large-scale, truly revolutionary rebellions in China?
Yeah, compared to other places.
Compared to, say, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, which completely overturned their societies. Chinese history has uprisings, dynastic changes, sure, but they often seem shallow somehow. The core system of peasant oppression seems to just endure. It feels counterintuitive.
It is a very curious historical observation and something historians debate a lot. You're right, there have been countless uprisings, peasant revolts, periods where dynasties fell, often talked about as the mandate of heaven being lost and shifting.
Right.
But typically, these events didn't fundamentally change the basic authoritarian structure of government or the peasant's place within that structure, not in the radical way those European revolutions did. The severe oppression, despite these cycles of rebellion, somehow consistently lasted.
So why? Why didn't that suffering lead to more radical change?
Well, this question of why fundamental structural change was so rare, despite all the hardship, brings us to a really interesting, though definitely unproven, theory. It tries to link society's diet to how likely people are to rebel or go to war.
The diet theory for rebellion.
Okay.
That sounds...
It's speculative, for sure, but it offers a provocative angle. It's crucial to stress up front, this is not scientifically proven. It's more of a theoretical idea from some anthropological or sociological thinkers.
Got it. Speculative.
Okay, so the hypothesis goes something like this. Societies that eat a lot of red meat diets, rich in certain proteins and fats, might tend to be more aggressive. Maybe more prone to conflict, more inclined to fight back against injustice or push for change.
Why red meat specifically?
The argument, again, highly theoretical, is that maybe this kind of diet provides more physical energy or perhaps fosters a more assertive psychological outlook. Or maybe it's just about having the sheer caloric surplus needed for sustained fighting.
Okay. So what's the other side of that coin?
The theory then contrasts this with agricultural societies that rely heavily on diets made up mostly of vegetables, grains, legumes. Places where red meat is scarce, maybe a luxury item for most people.
Like historical China for the vast majority.
Exactly. The idea is that these societies might show less desire for violent rebellion. Maybe they'd be more submissive, more focused on just getting by, more accepting of their situation. Their survival focus would be more on sustained hard labor, getting calories from plants that are readily available.
So if we think about China's historical diet, overwhelmingly plant-based for most people, right? Rice, millet, wheat, vegetables, beans. Meat was a rare treat for the average peasant. This theory, even though it's speculative, it kind of seems logical in that context, doesn't it? Against the backdrop of enduring authoritarian rule.
It does fit on a surface level, yeah. When you look at the big historical patterns, the sheer size of the population, that constant reliance on staple grains and vegetables, meat being a luxury, it could align with the idea of a population conditioned more towards hard work, obedience, and collective survival through compliance rather than through violent system-changing uprisings.
It's a really provocative thought, offers a different lens even if we can't prove it.
Absolutely. It just reminds us how even really basic things, like what people eat every day, might have these unexpected, potentially profound connections to broader societal behavior, political stability, how our basic needs can influence cultural paths.
Okay, so we've laid out these deep historical foundations.
Yep.
Massive population, strict authoritarian control, maybe even a populace conditioned by diet and circumstance towards resilience and obedience. But like you said, centuries have passed since some of those really ancient periods. Why does this famine mentality, this almost primal urge to eat anything, persist even now in modern China?
Yeah, how do we bridge that gap?
We need to connect it to more recent history, to an event that really burned this trauma into the national psyche. And that leads us straight into one of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century, anywhere in the world, the Great Mao Famine.
This period, especially under Mao Zedong's leadership, is absolutely the crucial link, the psychological scar tissue, if you will. The sources really paint Mao's rule as one defined by this immense concentration of power and this relentless, unbending vision for transforming China fast.
A dangerous combination.
Extremely. It starkly showed the dangers when that kind of unchecked authority gets wielded without enough caution or reality checks. Mao's rise itself was significant leader of the communist forces during the long civil war starting back in 1921. Then, after the communist victory in 1949, he founded the People's Republic of China. And he ruled it effectively until he died in 1976. His reign left this indelible mark, and in many ways a devastating one, reshaping the nation in ways still felt very strongly today.
And it was during his rule, specifically in 1958, that he launched the Great Leap Forward. Sounds ambitious, maybe even positive. But the reality was very different from that name, wasn't it?
Oh, worlds apart. It was this colossal undertaking. Yes, ambitious, but also incredibly brutal, an attempt to transform China almost overnight. Mao was obsessed, truly obsessed with rapidly industrializing the country, and at the same time, he wanted to completely abandon what he saw as outdated traditional culture.
Modernization at all costs.
Pretty much. His vision was to catapult China into the top tier of world industrial powers in just a few years. But the way he went about it was ruthless and completely detached from the realities on the ground. He set up these sprawling industrial cities, huge communes where millions of workers were essentially forced to live and work in state-controlled factories, often in terrible conditions.
Lives completely controlled by the state.
Their entire lives, every single moment, were engineered to revolve around work and hitting production targets for the state. And here's a critical point, the one that really set the stage for disaster. Their pay wasn't really money. It was primarily food rations. Just enough, barely enough for survival.
So if you didn't work or couldn't meet the target,
Then you faced dire consequences. If you were seen as unwilling or unable to work, or if you failed to meet these often impossible targets, you could starve, get sick and die from neglect, or face brutal punishment within these harsh commune systems.
okay, so if huge numbers of people were shifted into these industrial communes, who was growing the food? Where did the food for this massive new industrial workforce actually come from?
Ah, that's the other side of the coin, the agricultural exploitation. Alongside the industrial communes, they set up this parallel system. Highly regimented, almost militarized agricultural communes spread across the countryside.
Their only job was to feed the cities.
Their sole explicit purpose was to produce food for that rapidly growing industrial workforce. And these farming communes were hit with what you can only call unbelievable production quotas. Targets set often based on wildly inflated reports sent up the chain of command, or based on Mao's grand, completely unrealistic visions, not on what the land or the farmers could actually produce.
So destined to fail from the start.
Often, yes. Peasants were forced to work under extreme pressure. Every ounce of their energy, every hour of their day went towards trying to meet these impossible targets, often at the direct cost of their own food supply, their local environment, any semblance of their traditional way of life. They basically became tools in this giant state-run food machine.
And then, as if that wasn't enough upheaval and pressure, Mao launches the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This feels like something even deeper, an attempt to completely erase China's own history and identity.
That's a very accurate way to put it, and deeply unsettling. Mao's ambition went beyond just industry and food. He wanted a profound ideological purge. He wanted to cleanse the public memory of anything that didn't fit his new communist vision.
Erase the past entirely.
The Cultural Revolution was explicitly designed to sever China's connections to its ancient, incredibly rich, and globally influential past. Just think about it for a second. This is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. A culture that birthed countless inventions, philosophies, art forms that shaped the whole world. And one man decided to systematically try and dismantle and erase that memory.
The methods used were horrifying, weren't they?
Yeah.
Targeting the very fabric of society.
Absolutely horrific. The targets were incredibly broad, and the attacks deeply personal. Artisans, intellectuals, people who owned old books or historical artifacts, followers of Confucianism, religious leaders, basically anyone connected to China's traditional heritage or seen as holding bourgeois ideas, anyone deviating from Maoist orthodoxy.
What happened to them?
Public humiliation, brutal beatings, being sent to horrific labor camps where many died, or just outright execution. There are these chilling, well-documented stories of artisans having their hands physically cut off to stop them from creating traditional crafts, literally severing their link to their heritage.
Unbelievable cruelty.
Temples, symbols of ancient philosophies and faiths, were systematically attacked, defiled, many completely destroyed. Ancient texts, priceless records of history and thought, were burned in huge bonfires, these auto-da-fés. It was this massive state-run operation attacking people's identity, their beliefs, their values, their history.
And carried out by Chinese people against other Chinese people.
That's what makes it particularly chilling. Much of this violence and destruction was carried out by ordinary citizens, often young Red Guards, whipped into an ideological frenzy fueled by propaganda and fear. It was a complete psychological and cultural assault on the nation, from within.
So you've got impossible production targets, immense pressure, a culture being systematically ripped apart, a regime showing total disregard for individual lives. It sounds like a powder keg. You expect a breaking point, a massive rebellion.
You would think so.
But as you pointed out earlier, large-scale system-changing revolutions were rare in China. So what was the final straw? What tipped things into utter catastrophe if it wasn't a popular uprising?
That final fatal trigger came from the most unexpected and, in hindsight, tragically absurd source imaginable. Sparrows.
Sparrows, the little birds.
Yes, sparrows. This happened back in 1958, right at the peak of Mao's sort of megalomania, his grand vision phase. He and his officials, operating with virtually zero understanding of ecology and this hugely overinflated sense of their own wisdom, they made a simple observation.
What did they see?
They saw sparrows pecking at spilled grains on the ground near granaries or threshing floors. Simple enough. But from this, they drew a disastrously flawed conclusion.
Which was?
Sparrows eat grain. Therefore, these sparrows must also be eating the grain growing in the fields. They are pests. They are preventing us from meeting our glorious production quotas.
Oh no, that's incredibly flawed logic. Sparrows eat insects too, don't they? Lots of them.
Exactly. They are a crucial part of the ecosystem controlling insect populations. But that ecological reality was completely ignored, or maybe just unknown to them. Based on this simplistic, flawed logic, a catastrophic command went out.
What was the command?
The order, now infamously known as the Smash Sparrows Campaign, or sometimes just Mao's Birds Decree, was sent out across the entire nation. With terrifying efficiency, the command was brutally simple. Hunt and kill every single sparrow.
Every single one. Nationwide.
Nationwide. And what happened next was just astounding, an almost unimaginable display of state-mobilized mass action. The Chinese people, largely conditioned by this point to follow central orders with discipline, often driven by fear, participated eagerly. Propaganda posters called sparrows public enemies of the people.
How did they even kill them all?
People banged pots and pans, beat drums, waved flags relentlessly. The goal was to prevent the sparrows from landing anywhere to rest. They just kept them flying until they dropped dead from pure exhaustion. Millions upon millions, perhaps tens of millions of birds were slaughtered, shot, poisoned, trapped, or just hounded to death.
And this was seen as a success.
It was celebrated, hailed as a great victory for the revolution, for modernization. State media dutifully reported it as a triumph. They genuinely believed they had eliminated a major pest, a key obstacle to achieving agricultural abundance.
But this mass killing, this huge disruption of the ecosystem, it must have had terrifying, unforeseen consequences.
Terrifying is the right word. The ecological blowback was swift, and the scale was catastrophic. Initially, yes, there might have been a very slight temporary bump in the grain harvest right after the sparrows vanished. Maybe Mao and his team saw this as proof they were right.
Uh-oh.
But what actually followed was an ecological nightmare straight out of the Old Testament. A classic example of a trophic cascade. You remove a key predator, and the whole system collapses.
What happened?
With their main natural predators, the sparrows gone across the entire country, populations of crop-eating insects exploded. Locusts, aphids, caterpillars, all sorts of pests suddenly had no checks. It wasn't just a small imbalance, it was this plague, an uncontrolled surge of insects devouring crops in the fields at an unbelievable rate. Fields were stripped bare.
Locust plagues.
Exactly, and as if that wasn't devastating enough, a massive plague of rats followed too. They multiplied rapidly, destroying grain that was harvested and stored because the sparrows had also eaten rat eggs and young.
So it hit food production from multiple angles.
Completely devastated it. It sounds like something from an ancient myth, doesn't it? A plague unleashed by human arrogance and ignorance.
It really does. Did they try to fix it?
They did, eventually. China, in this desperate, belated move, tried to import millions of sparrows from the Soviet Union and other places. But it was just too late. The ecological damage was done. The entire agricultural system, already stretched to breaking point by those insane quotas, just completely collapsed under the weight of this insect and rat invasion.
And the impact on people.
A tsunami of hunger. It hit the millions of industrial workers first, remember, the ones paid mostly in food rations. Suddenly those rations weren't there. China, with around 800 million people then, was plunged into, well, the sources call it a living hell. The Great Mao Famine, directly triggered by this unbelievable ecological blunder, was now fully underway. And it was devastating.
As this food crisis spiraled completely out of control, the agricultural system collapsing, the regime under Mao made another horrific choice, didn't they? A strategic, morally bankrupt decision about who would bear the brunt.
Tragically, yes. As the famine deepened, the leadership made the callous, calculated decision to effectively sacrifice the rural population. Food imports, especially vital grain shipments coming in from places like the Soviet Union, were deliberately channeled primarily to the cities.
Why the cities?
The cynical logic, completely rooted in the regime's desire to preserve its own power, was to maintain order and keep industry going in the urban centers. They prioritized the stability of the Communist Party, their big industrialization projects, directly at the expense of the countryside, where the vast majority of people actually lived.
It just underscores that grim observation, doesn't it? Governments sometimes prioritizing their own power, their big ideas, over the lives of the most vulnerable, especially rural populations.
It's a deeply cynical pattern seen throughout history, unfortunately. Protecting the power base, the urban centers, often comes first.
So the rural communes, already struggling with impossible quotas, now facing ecological disaster. They were just cut off. Left to starve.
That's exactly what happened. Those communes that failed to meet their grain targets, which was almost all of them by this point, due to the pests and mismanagement, were systematically cut off from any state food aid. Completely abandoned. Left to fend for themselves as the crisis worsened. Isolated and desperate.
What did people do? How did this starvation progress?
The progression, as documented by survivors and historians like Yang Zhisheng, was horrifyingly consistent across vast areas. First, people ate every single available animal. Dogs, cats, rats, mice, any wild birds left, frogs, snakes, anything that moved.
This wasn't hunting for sport.
God, no. This was millions of people in a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. Survivors talk about tearing apart and eating raw any creature they could catch. No time to clean it, cook it, sometimes not even sure what it was, because if you hesitated, someone else would grab it. This led to the total collapse of local wildlife, livestock gone, entire local ecosystems just wiped clean of animal life.
And when the animals were all gone, the desperation must have reached truly unthinkable levels.
It did. The famine diet descended into realms that are just hard for us to comprehend today. People started eating insects systematically, ants, beetles, locusts, if they could find them. Then they moved on to grass, weeds, digging up wild roots, then tree bark, stripping trees bare, and eventually even eating mud clay just to try and fill their stomachs or maybe get some tiny mineral content.
Eating mud.
That was the reality for millions, a descent into this primal struggle where all normal ideas of what is food just completely vanished. But even that wasn't the absolute bottom. We found these incredibly harrowing accounts, survivor testimonies, that capture the true depth of despair, the total breakdown of society.
There's one specific account you mentioned from a survivor, a young girl at the time. It's incredibly difficult to hear, but it seems crucial to understanding the depth of this trauma. Could you share her story?
Yes. This account comes from a lost interview that resurfaced later. This woman, who was just a small girl during the famine, described her village. All the food had run out months before. She herself was skeletal, bones showing, too weak to even stand up properly. Her father had died of starvation a few months earlier.
What happened to him?
When he collapsed, other villagers, driven by this unimaginable hunger, immediately fell upon his body. They dismembered him, boiled the remains, and ate him. This, she explained calmly, had become normal, a common sight. People were forced to eat the dead to survive. She even mentioned that when there were no recent deaths, some desperate people resorted to digging up old graves looking for anything remotely edible. The social fabric wasn't just torn, it was obliterated.
And her mother's story is particularly haunting. A final act of sacrifice.
It's almost beyond words. Her mother, knowing she was dying, completely depleted, unable to fight the hunger or despair any longer, closed the door of their little hut. She sat her daughter down, put a small, dull knife next to her, and she made this unbelievable request.
What did she say?
She told her daughter, her voice just a whisper, "When I die, I want you to eat me before the others come and take my body. Eat as much as you can. It's the only way you might live." The little girl was crying hysterically, unable to process the horror. Soon after, her mother just collapsed, died right there.
My God. What did the daughter do in that impossible situation?
It took her time, she said, to even grasp it, but she knew, with this chilling certainty, that the neighbors, hearing the silence, driven by their own starvation, would break in soon. So, propelled by pure survival instinct and her mother's last words, she did it. She ate parts of her mother's already emaciated legs, as much as her tiny, weak body could handle.
And the neighbors.
Just as she feared. Shortly after they heard the silence, they broke down the door, they came in, and right in front of her, they dismembered and consumed the rest of her mother's body.
So no words.
The survivor's final words in that testimony just hang in the air. She said, "Mao took not only our families, he took our humanity."
He took our humanity. That's a devastating summary. It gives you this chilling insight into the complete moral and social collapse.
It really does. And this story, while uniquely horrifying in its details, wasn't an isolated case, not by a long shot. The book Tombstone by Yang Zhisheng, who was a former state journalist and spent years painstakingly researching the famine, is filled with meticulously documented accounts of similar events across China.
He describes a sequence.
Yes, this horrifying sequence where people ate the animals first, then the plants, the weeds, the bark, then insects, then mud. And finally, when there was literally nothing else, they consumed the dead. Sometimes bodies found, sometimes bodies from fresh graves, sometimes other means. Region after region fell into this pattern until absolutely nothing edible by any definition was left. These were the unimaginable depths reached during the Great Mao Famine, a stark, terrifying reminder of our most basic survival drive.
So considering these horrors, what was the actual scale, the human cost of this catastrophe?
The human cost was just staggering, almost incomprehensible. During that main famine period, roughly 1959 to 1961, maybe extending a bit, the best estimates we have now, based on careful demographic work looking at census data and mortality rates, they suggest upwards of 60 million people died.
60 million.
60 million. And let's be clear, that number generally excludes the deaths from executions or exhaustion in the labor camps during the Great Leap Forward, or those killed during the Cultural Revolution purges later. This is primarily deaths from starvation and related diseases directly due to the famine policies.
60 million. It's hard to even picture that number.
To try and give it some perspective, that's roughly the entire population of a country like Turkey today, or Italy, or the UK, just wiped out in about 3 years.
By starvation and state policy, it's undeniably one of the deadliest man-made disasters in all of human history.
How did it finally end, this horrific famine? And maybe the most astonishing part, what happened to Mao, the architect of these policies?
The famine eventually subsided, but not through some sudden enlightenment or effective government action, really. It was a slow, tragic combination of factors. Part of it was nature starting to rebalance very slowly. Sparrows and other predators eventually started to return to the devastated ecosystems, bringing insect populations slightly back under control over time.
So nature healing itself, somewhat. Somewhat, yes. Belated food imports, eventually arriving in larger quantities, also played a role in alleviating the worst of it in some areas. But tragically, a significant factor in the famine ending was simply the sheer number of people who had already died. The population pressure on the non-existent food supply was reduced through mass death.
That's a grim way for it to end. And Mao himself.
This is what's truly shocking to many. Despite overseeing policies that directly led to this unimaginable suffering and death toll, Mao Zedong himself faced no real consequences. He remained in power. He died of natural causes, seemingly unrelated to the famine in 1976 at the age of 82.
And the Communist Party.
Even more astonishingly, perhaps, his party, the Communist Party of China, CPC, didn't collapse under the weight of this disaster. It weathered the storm, maintained control, and continues to govern China to this very day. The system, the mindset, the mechanisms of control, in many crucial ways, they endured.
So this brings us right back to our starting point, doesn't it? We've found a profound, deeply disturbing answer to why some Chinese culinary practices might include things that seem shocking elsewhere. It comes directly from this deep generational hunger trauma.
Absolutely. That's the core of it. The reason many Chinese people, particularly older generations or those whose families directly experience these times, sometimes seem willing to eat almost anything. It's rooted in this profound historical trauma of starvation.
It's learned behavior passed down.
It's more than just learned behavior. It's almost imprinted. Generations raised by survivors who literally ate mud, grass, bark, insects, even human flesh to stay alive. They were taught, maybe not always explicitly, but through the sheer horror of lived experience and the stories passed down, to see everything as a potential food source. Every scrap, every living thing could be the difference between life and death.
A survival instinct becoming a cultural trait.
Exactly. This trauma doesn't just vanish when bellies are full for a generation or two. It's still there, deep in the collective psyche. It manifests as this underlying vigilance against scarcity, this incredibly broad definition of what might constitute food in a crisis. It's a fundamental survival instinct elevated to a cultural memory.
A powerful, lingering scar on the nation's soul, still influencing things today. Okay, let's shift gears then. Fast forward to modern China. It's a global economic giant now, vastly different from the Mao era. Have things changed completely? Is this famine trauma still relevant, or have prosperity kind of erased those lessons?
Well, the trauma definitely lingers under the surface, no doubt about it. But yes, outwardly, there have been huge positive changes. In modern urban China, especially, eating things like insects or cats and dogs, other more exotic animals, that's gradually decreasing. You see a growing awareness, influenced by global ideas about animal welfare, food safety, and just rising living standards.
So dietary habits are shifting.
Definitely shifting, particularly among younger people and in the big cities. There's a clear move towards more conventional protein sources.
Mm.
However, and this is absolutely crucial, that underlying ticking time bomb we talked about earlier, the massive population, that remains a fundamental and arguably increasingly pressing challenge for China. And honestly, the clock feels like it's ticking faster now than ever before. Prosperity might have masked the vulnerability for a while, but it hasn't eliminated it.
What's this new crisis then? This looming threat China faces today, despite all its economic and industrial might. It feels like the ghost of scarcity might be returning.
That's a good way to put it. Since around 2020, maybe a bit earlier, China has started facing new, really severe pressures on its food security, and these pressures are coming from both the environment and arguably from its own success. We're talking about rapidly changing climate conditions and this absolutely insatiable demand for resources driven by that enormous population, its huge economy, and changing consumption patterns.
So production can't keep up with demand.
The stark reality is that China's domestic food production is seriously struggling to meet this escalating demand. We're not just talking minor dips or market ups and downs here. It's becoming a systemic challenge, a really acute one.
And we're seeing the impacts very clearly, especially with water scarcity, right? The news reports on droughts have been alarming.
Extremely alarming. We've seen major prolonged droughts in just the last couple years, 2022, 2023. These have drastically slashed crop yields across really critical farming areas. Think about the Yangtze River. It's a lifeline for millions, a crucial artery for agriculture. It hit its lowest water levels in decades recently. That cripples irrigation.
And the future predictions.
There was a recent report. It cited a really, really serious figure. It predicted that these ongoing droughts, plus the broader impacts of climate change, like extreme heat and floods, are likely to indirectly affect something like 900 million people in China in the coming years.
900 million out of
Yeah.
1.4 billion.
Yeah. Nearly two-thirds of the entire population could face serious consequences linked to food and water scarcity. This isn't some distant theoretical problem for the next century. It's an unfolding crisis right now, with potentially massive human consequences.
And this is where those echoes of history feel so strong. It feels like China might be facing another self-inflicted wound in a way. Not from killing sparrows this time, but through a different path.
That's a powerful way to see it, and I think it's accurate. What's striking is how China finds itself facing these similar kinds of vulnerabilities again. But this time, they stem largely from the unintended consequences of its own incredible rapid industrial growth. And sometimes, maybe, development that didn't fully account for the environmental cost.
Can you give us some scale on that?
Let's look at the numbers. That 2022 drought alone, just one event, impacted 2.2 million hectares of agricultural land. And that was just in a few key farming provinces like Sichuan, Hebei, Hunan.
2.2 million hectares. How big is that, really?
Okay, for comparison, the entire actively farmed land area of a country like Turkey is about 8.4 million hectares. So in just a few regions, in 1 year's drought, China lost the productive capacity equivalent to about a quarter of Turkey's total farmland.
Wow, that's immense. And this time, the root cause isn't a specific policy like the sparrows, but the side effects of industrialization itself.
Precisely. China has maybe inadvertently created a whole new set of ecological weak points, this time through decades of unchecked industrial expansion, rapid urbanization, and development that often prioritized economic growth above almost everything else, including environmental protection.
What kind of environmental degradation are we talking about?
It's been widespread and severe. Rivers, absolutely vital for irrigation, have either dried up completely because of overextraction for cities and industry or excessive damming, or they've become so heavily polluted with industrial chemicals and waste that the water is just unusable for farming, sometimes even toxic.
So the water sources are compromised.
Hugely. Plus, vast areas of previously fertile land have been lost to desertification, soil erosion, chemical contamination from factories and fertilizers. This industrial boom, while undeniably lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty and creating incredible prosperity, has come at a massive and now very undeniable ecological price. It's creating this incredibly precarious situation for the future food supply.
So it really is a profound reminder. Nature has its limits. There's always a balance, and disrupting it inevitably leads to consequences.
It's a fundamental truth, isn't it? And nature enforces it, often brutally. Nature relies on this delicate balance, this incredibly complex web of connections. If
Yeah.
you break it, whether through ignorance, like with the Sparrow campaign, or through unsustainable development and pollution, like with parts of the industrial boom, there will be consequences. They always come back.
Just on different timescales sometimes.
Exactly. The Sparrow campaign consequences were almost immediate, catastrophic within a year or two. The consequences of industrial pollution and climate change might manifest a bit more slowly, build up over decades, but they are proving to be no less devastating. They're creating these new, unprecedented pressures on an already strained food system for a still enormous population. History seems to keep offering these very poignant lessons, if only we're willing to learn them.
Okay, let's bring this deep dive full circle then. We started by asking why a culture with such a rich, ancient food history also consumes things that seem unusual, even shocking, to outsiders. And we found that one of the biggest, deepest reasons is undeniably this historical, multi-generational hunger trauma, stemming particularly from the Great Mao Famine.
Yeah, it's that deep-seated survival instinct, that cultural memory born from unimaginable suffering that broadened the very definition of what counts as food.
That trauma is a powerful, persistent force. But as we look ahead now, you're saying a new threat looms, potentially another great famine maybe, driven this time not by specific bad policy, but by these huge, inexorable forces of climate change and the fallout from past industrial overreach.
That's the concern, yes. With these reports predicting that 900 million people could be affected by water and food scarcity in the coming years. It forces us to ask a really difficult, sobering question. And this is something for you, our listener, to really think about.
What's the question?
In the face of potentially overwhelming numbers, renewed desperation on that kind of scale, what else might be viewed as food? Or maybe even who else? What could the consequences be this time for society, for individuals? What does the cyclical nature of crisis and survival tell us about humanity's deepest, most primal drives?
It's a truly provocative thought, a stark reminder of both the incredible resilience and sometimes the terrifying desperation that humanity is capable of.